Hi, everybody. This is Bill De La Cruz, your host of the Origination Point podcast, and we're really glad that you are back with us. And we've been talking over the last few interviews about identity and labeling and diversity and equity and inclusion, and really approaching it from the perspective of people telling their stories. And so it's a way for you all to be able to hear how people are really working with these issues, both on a personal level and in their professional lives, and not doing it from a political perspective. So, kind of what I would refer to as real talk about equity and inclusion and identity and labels. And if you've listened to the past few podcasts, we look at labels as the way other people see us. So they're not really true to who we are versus identity, which is how I see myself. And so we have another special guest this afternoon, and I'm going to let Luz introduce herself and just say, welcome. I'm so glad that we could finally make this work.
Hi, Bill. I am Dr. Luz Casquejo-Johnston, and I am coming to you from the San Francisco Bay Area in a town north of Berkeley called El Cerrito. And I'm here to talk a little bit about identity. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm a cisgender uh, Filipinx woman. So what I also like to say is that I am an American of Filipino descent. And the reason I like to say that, Bill, is because for many Asians, we are considered or greeted always as an immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
There, we have facial features that make us look like we could be recently arrived. But I was born here in the United States, outside of Detroit. My parents immigrated in 1967 under the Hart-Celler 1965 Act of Naturalization, which gave a preference for foreign-born um, foreign-born peoples who had professional degrees. My mother had finished her pediatrics, her medical degree with a specialization in pediatrics from the University of Santo Tomas, and my father had completed his civil engineering degree from the same institution. So they came to the United States with the opportunity for careers, which is a little bit of a different experience of many immigrants prior to this act. So my mom had an internship opportunity at Wayne State University, which is in Detroit. So what's interesting for me is that I have gotten in the past, oh, you speak English so well. Like, yeah, that's because I was born here. And I also had the opportunity at one point to interview Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who's written two books, Assimilation Blues, and the one that she's most famous for. Bill, help me. What's her other book? Assimilation Blues, and
I can see it. I forgot the name of it.
anyway, I had the opportunity to interview her, and one of the things she talked about, which we were able to discuss in this interview, was the fact that any child who is not welcomed, and you talked about identity or race as a social construct, we know that race is something that is read by others. So those who are not read in the world as white often have a story of racialization. And when we were having this interview, it was the first time I thought, oh, yes, I have that story. And so my story of racialization was at 4 years old, which is not uncommon. Um, I don't know if you have your own story,
Mhm.
Bill, of that kind of understanding. I was 4 years old. I had been, four. You run off, right? That's how
Right.
kids are.
Right.
So I ran off in the mall. I got separated from my family. A and I still remember what this man wore, what he looked like. He had on brown corduroy pants and a plaid shirt, right? So this is obviously a core memory for me that I'm 53 now. So it's almost 50 years ago, and I still remember the texture of his pants and what he was wearing.
Wow.
But, he came up to me and said, "Where are you from?" Right? And I, I said, if you live in Michigan, you point at your hand and you point out where on the mitten, right? And so I
Got
said,
it.
I'm from here." He's like, "No, where are you from?" I said, "Oh, I'm from uh, Taylor, Michigan?" And he just kept asking and asking. And at one point, I could tell that he was angry.
Mm,
So I was not answering in the way that he was expecting. And that's when I realized he is not talking about my geographic location. He is talking about where he is othering me. He is telling me I do not belong here. And I do remember having an experience of being like almost lifted out of my body and then noticing this is again 4 years old, looking around and noticing that I was the only non white person in this mall in outside of Detroit. And just realizing, like looking at the skin tone and just realizing, oh, he's talking to me because I don't belong. I am
mm,
different from him and therefore I am other. And so it was my first introduction to understanding or having a racialization experience, as Dr. Tatum was explaining to me. And I think it's one of those things that, again, is a core memory. I remember what this person was wearing. I remember how he spoke to me. I remember how his tone changed. And when his tone changed to not just questioning, but of not just questioning my geographic location, but questioning my identity, that's when I realized, oh, I am different. And not only am I different, I am almost not supposed to be here, was the thought. There was shame. Um, and then there was just a lot of questioning. And I grew up in a time, so this is probably 1975, when people were not talking about race,
yeah,
especially in my family's community. I do think that other communities, especially those who descended from the formerly enslaved, they had to talk about race. We're talking about Detroit, but I didn't necessarily have to do that, and my parents were not equipped. Again, my parents were immigrants, so um, they they were just trying to make it work in a new environment.
it's
So
so interesting how those interactions can stay with us for so long in terms of just how they affect, like you said, not just how others see us, how we also begin to see ourselves. And even this whole idea of when we say Asian, most people don't realize that there's 23 different countries in Asia. And so
yeah,
even that's a stereotype. Oh, you're Asian.
yeah,
Well, no, actually,
right,
you could be Filipino or Thai or Japanese or any number of other ethnicities. And
yeah,
in the and that group is looked at as the model minority as well in terms of,
right,
well, look, why can't you be successful like they are? And
exactly.
it's and there's a whole other conversation we can have about that. And so I just wanted to bring that into people's awareness as well. And that
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
question about, oh, no, 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 where are you really from? Like
Yeah,
trying
where are
to
you really
have that
from?
experience
Um,
like you had with that gentleman, and him even getting angry because he probably
mhm.
wanted to hear you say, I'm from somewhere in Asia.
Yeah. And it actually, when he said, "Where are you from? Where are you really from?" Then the question was that was the tipping point for me was, "Where are your parents from?"
Right.
And that's what tripped it in my mind because I had heard stories and I had heard my parents talking about coming to the US and the term called, of immigrating. And they had a homeland that they missed. And that's when I went, oh. Where are they from? They talk about the Philippines. So we don't belong here because they didn't grow up here.
Yeah.
So it's a lot to take on as a little person. I think these core memories you talked about, like how long it sticks with you, the longer what causes either big T or little t trauma is the um, inability to process what is happening to us in the moment.
Hmm.
So, what I really wanted to talk about is talking about how do we help young people have healthy understanding of their identities, and how do we walk beside them as they are learning about racialization, especially in the United States, because it is really different, right?
Yep.
So, and I love that you called out the model minority because, as you know, as we all know, and you've probably had other guests talk about, none of these stereotypes are helpful. You
Yep.
know, I would love to, I would, love to share that I was put into classes I had no business being in. I remember being in a planar geometry, so sophomore level geometry in seventh grade. I had no clue what I was doing. I really struggled, and there was no one to help me. And a lot of it was like, well, you should get this. It's math. You're Asian.
Right.
No one said that. But there was definitely a like, why don't you get this? And my dad, being an engineer, was a terrible tutor. He did a lot of like, it's so simple,
Yeah. For you, it
and
is.
just like yeah, and just like yelling at me, and I'd be like, so the yelling is actually shutting down my learning.
Yeah.
But yeah,
And
I
it's
think it
interesting. I
doesn't.
just want to clarify for our listeners that socialized stereotype is that all Asians are good at math. And so I had
Yes.
a friend I worked with who was Korean, and she said, when I was in sixth grade, I finally had to tell my teachers, I'm not one of those Asians who likes math. I really love to
Yeah.
be creative. So, can I take more art classes or dance classes or
Right.
something like that to the same experience that you had? She was being put into all these math classes, and it was a complete disinterest for her. And so that's the
Right.
danger of stereotypes because we don't really check for their truthfulness. We just make an assumption that
Right.
you are that
Yeah.
because that's how I have labeled you. So,
Right. Yeah. And in the Asian, my growing up, talking to other Asians about it, there was like this joking, like, I didn't get that gene. And it was a deficit model for sure, like, "Oh, I'm
mhm,
one of the Asians that didn't get that gene." So here's the thing, if many people experience that, then it's not true.
right.
But there's no one to talk about how it's not true because you're just experiencing it. And so if your Asianness is then in question, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, so now I'm other, and then I'm
Yep.
other than other because
Right.
I don't fit the stereotype.
And you don't fit what America looks at and says, oh, yeah, you're from here.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. So then you walk, and I think this is the experience of many people who grow up as children of the people who have immigrated. You walk between two worlds. So I am a poet, and I wrote a poem about how you have to keep a part of yourself at home. So all of the things, right, that you better not have leftovers going to school. You better have a sandwich on white bread.
Mm,
So it's these experiences of keeping parts of ourselves private and not being able to be ourselves in the world and then coming home. So the image in this poem was all about the door frame and how sometimes things would get caught in the door frame, and I would bring my American self into the house and get in trouble for it. Or maybe on the way out, bring part of my
yeah.
Filipino self into school and be othered for that. So there's this experience that we navigate um, of having not matching the dominant culture. So, and that again is around labeling, right? So
Right.
if you're Asian, this is how you Like if you're going to fit in our mainstream culture, in the dominant culture, you need to be this, this, and this. And you need to, you know, we all experienced it. I'm sure you did too. Like you need to wear this, and this to fit
Mhm.
in. You need to speak this, and this. You need to be up on the popular culture. You need, you know, so all of these things, which then when we come home, you know, my parents were struggling to find music that they loved, right? Luckily, you know, I grew up outside of Detroit, so my dad really loved Motown, and so
That's
this
cool.
became the soundtrack of our lives, right? Which was, you know, another unexpected, like, oh, you know,
I'm sure
you
that's
know,
an
you know,
interesting picture for somebody on
yeah,
the outside seeing your dad getting down on Motown and
yeah. You know, also we're there. Many Filipino families are musical. Many. I don't want to speak and generalize, but
Mhm.
our family was musical.
Okay.
We loved to get together and sing and dance, and so here we are. You know, when it's going on, we're singing Smokey Robinson. When the Jackson Five is coming out, we're like the Jackson Five, but we're Filipino, and it's this group of Filipino kids, and they're singing Jackson 5 songs. Right? I
Yeah.
don't know who Michael. I think I do actually. I think my cousin Rob was probably he had the best voice. I think. So we're doing all the things where one of my uncles was really into the Beatles, the other was really into Elvis, and really followed Elvis to the end. And my dad was more of like the Rat Pack and
Okay.
Frank Sinatra and that, you know, so it's like we really, and they were really trying to identify um, as Americans, right? So adopting all of that music was part of it.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
there's like a whole generation of immigrants who came and then like for me raised the children to be white to be able to
Hmm.
assimilate, only it didn't change any of this. Like
Right,
so
exactly.
that's what
Yeah. So,
people see, and then they label you. And I've had people say, "Oh, you speak so well," and I was like, "Well,
right,
what
right,
did you expect?" And because I
right.
didn't
Or,
fit their stereotype, and so
yeah,
that I love the door frame metaphor also because it's that idea of assimilating versus acculturating. So when we're assimilating, we want to be American, whatever that is,
mhm,
and then if we're acculturating, we're bringing the best of what we have to everybody else. Where
yeah,
if you were in a more acculturated school, you might have brought your food that you loved for lunch, and people would have said, "Oh, tell me more about that." Versus, "Oh,
right.
that's
Yeah,
weird," whatever it is
yeah,
that kids do. So
yeah. I think it's generational too.
yeah,
You know, this is, again, growing up in the 70s and 80s is very different. So, my experience, so I'm 53. I have two grown kids. My kids are, Ben will be, is about to turn 26, and Sophia will turn 29. So by the time they were in school, and again, I raised them in California. So we moved to California in 1979.
okay.
California is a different beast, man. There's a ton of Asian culture there. So,
Yeah,
especially in Orange County, which is where I grew up. So, um, by the time my children were born in 1995 and 98 is different. You know, they could bring leftovers. You know,
right.
actually, it became this thing of like, ooh, what's in your container? And trying things out. You know, I raised them for the most part in the Bay Area, and then also in Southern California. It was like, ooh, kids who brought sushi were like the cool kids. Which when I grew up, if anyone brought sushi, I don't even know what would have happened, but it wouldn't be like, ooh, can I try some? You know, so I think the culture is changing. Um, and I think what's interesting for me is that my children are biracial, and they are read in the world in very different ways. My son is sometimes greeted and welcomed as a white male. He is sometimes read as an Asian male. He is sometimes read as a Hispanic male. And
Mm,
depending on where he is and how he is being received, he receives different treatment.
sure.
So imagine what that's like to sometimes have privilege and sometimes not. It's confusing. My daughter, on the other hand, is always read and always greeted as an Asian woman. And so that's different too, right?
Yeah, because
So,
even the gender roles play into that
mhm,
as well, I think, to some degree.
yeah. And I think, as I started understanding, I think the push to have ethnic studies in high school is important because I didn't have the language.
Mm.
My parents didn't have the language. I didn't necessarily have the language. And I was a teacher, right? So I didn't have the language. I wasn't passing that on, that kind of understanding of what is racialization. Race is a social construct. None of those things were in
Mhm.
my consciousness. And so I don't feel that my children had the benefit of somebody who had that framing. I came into that awareness as an adult, as an adult and learning about, I think for me, that awakening came really late, like 2017.
Mm.
And that had to do with the fact that I had become an active member and a board member of a group called Montessori for Social Justice.
Okay.
And it really was started by folks of color in the Montessori movement because they felt that there needed to be a space where they could be their full selves. So my understanding came from uh, tr- workshops and trainings that I attended, and it made me really understand, that we're all in this together, that racialization and the stereotypes associated with that actually doesn't help anyone, it
Mm.
harms everyone.
Yeah.
So,
And I think, we've talked about our experiences as that generation that were socialized to be American, or from my parents' perspective, know how to be white because then you won't be discriminated against. And then my daughter's about the same age as yours. And when she went to college, she had friends who were so multiracial and so multi ethnic that it wasn't even a thing for her in terms of being
mhm,
around people who had multiple identities. So they were all
yeah,
able to intermix. And then when I think about our young people today who are growing up in this really racial polarization and the stereotypical divisiveness that we're seeing in our country and in our world in terms of people's labels. I won't say identity because it's really how other people are seeing them. So so I want to shift to, what do you think this generation of young people really need to understand this conversation, regardless of how they identify racially, in terms of what we're talking about, and in really understanding their own identity without buying in so much to those socialized stereotypes that we all have been inculcated with.
yeah, I think it's around, you know, I now work to help schools and teachers specifically, and also parents, to understand how to create environments where children can be their authentic selves. So that's the first component. I think for me, everything has to start in the I first and then in the social structure second. So you actually can't be I think it's so much better for young people to understand who they are first. That way, when they come into contact with a bigger group in a school setting, they can firmly stand in their eye. They can be like, yeah, my parents are immigrants, and that's great. So I don't know that I certainly, I did talk about, my parents were immigrants and I'm Filipino. They knew that there was this difference, right? But giving children a healthy understanding of what it means to be uh, what it means to be who we are. So using the specific language that makes sense for children at the time.
Yeah.
So when I'm working with teachers and parents, I talk about only giving the information that the children ask about. So if they ask about skin tone, we're going to talk about skin tone. And there's a lot of really wonderful books out there now that refer to skin tone in terms of non. There has been a lot of usage of food for skin tones, which then um, is a commodification almost of people of color. And so to think about them in terms of natural elements like sand and trees and things like that is a way that doesn't commodify that.
Interesting.
So there's lots of books about that.
Yeah.
So just talking about, yeah, melanin, and this is why. And um, a long time ago, melanin was created in order to do its scientific thing without getting too, you don't have to get so scientific with young people. If they're just asking about skin tone,
Right.
just say, like, our skin is different, and these are how you can call them. That way, children are not shamed, because what ends up happening is that a child will use a term that people are then like, teachers are like, oh, I can't believe you used that word. Well, it's
Right.
like, of course they use that word. They're little and they don't know another word. So I'm not saying it's okay for a child to say something like, oh, that person's skin looks like dirt. I understand that it may hurt the other child, but if you have not given the child a different language, you can expect that they're going to use the vocabulary
That's
that they
that's out
have,
there, right? Yeah. So let me
right?
ask you
So,
this, because I find this really interesting, because I'm just curious your take on it. I'll share with you mine. So when you work with, let's say, teachers about this, do you find them really quickly wanting to say something like, well, how do I do this with my kids versus what do I need to do to learn about myself?
yeah,
I mean,
always.
what I tell people is you can't model what you don't do. So if you're not
Yes,
actually
I love
doing
that.
this yourself, then there's no way you can model it to a young person or to a student or to a family member or even to one of your colleagues, because you're not doing it yourself. And they want to jump too quick to, well, let me see how this works with my students. And it's almost a way to say, really interesting. I don't really need this, but let me teach my kids about it. And that's where I go back to, first of all, you're not teaching, you're modeling, and you can't model what you don't do. So I'm curious what your
Mhm.
experience has been with that and how you pull people back into their own work versus wanting to extrapolate it to other people or to have other people
So
do it.
I think it comes from an honest place. I think, if you're working with teachers, they want to teach.
Right,
And it's not necessarily part of teaching. I work for a teacher credential program in the state of California, and identity development is so core. But not all teacher credentialing programs include that. And so they're teachers, and they've been
right,
modeled to teach, which is to get up and do a lesson, right? But that has always been my experience, Bill. It's interesting that you said that, because I thought, oh, I agree that they
yeah,
want to do the thing versus be the thing. So
right,
I I talk to them about the fact that if this is new to you, it's going to feel uncomfortable,
right,
and that's okay. And this is new to you, you're going to make a mistake, and that's okay. Um, I think the way that I phrase it, because they're teachers, right? So they understand learning. I talk about it in terms of it being like a second language. So if it's not material that you're used to, you need some time to absorb it before to absorb it and use it and apply it before it you can really embody it. So do that work first and share what you feel really grounded in, and then go. And that's why I talk
yeah,
about starting with the things that we can see with our five senses, right? And then we can talk about we can talk about immigration. We can talk about why do people immigrate. That was one of the things that I brought to my own children's experience, was to understand why did their grandparents move from the Philippines, and how do they
Yep.
feel about that? And even as young people, they could hear the yearning. My parents would go back to the Philippines. They wanted to be back there. And so we talk about, why do people move? I don't think everybody talks about the American dream, but no one talks about the fact that if there is an American dream, there's also a reason for leaving. And when we
Right.
talk about immigration, we need to talk about the fact that people grieve that. If you talk to immigrants, they want to go back. They want to visit.
Right, because they're leaving
Um,
everything that's
it-
familiar to them to come to this new place of however it's been framed, prosperity, have your dreams made, and
this,
people don't realize everything that you have to leave to do that.
yeah, there's a big, I think there's a lot to that, and I think when we talk about that, then we can talk about justice,
Hmm.
and we can talk about equity, and we can talk about what could we do so that in Tagalog, Lolo and Lola is Lolo is grandfather, Lola is grandmother. What do you think we could do for Lolo and Lola so that they don't have to
Hmm.
immigrate? Like, what did they
Right.
talk about? Oh, they talked about how it was really hard to find steady work. So how could we talk about that in those terms? We could talk about we could talk about food distribution. A lot of they would talk about how it was hard to get food. So how do we talk about that kind of like food justice, how environmental
Yeah.
justice? Maybe some people immigrated because there was an environmental disaster.
Yeah.
So how do we talk about that?
Well,
And I think it just goes from there.
and I think it's also an important understanding in what you said is that this is this is like challenging to have these conversations, and nobody's perfect at it, and it takes practice. And
No.
I was talking to someone today that is thinking of bringing me in to do some work, and they said, well, we have all these engineer types, and they want to do everything perfect, and they're asking me
Yeah.
to come in to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, and I had to just say to them, part of what I'll share with you is this approach, it's about practice, it's not about perfection. Because
Hmm.
even people like us who do this work and who would be practitioners, I'll speak for myself, I make missteps and I make mistakes and I say things where somebody gets offended, and I just have to now figure out how do I own it, accept it, and
Hmm.
apologize if I need to, and then learn from it. So I think that's just an
Yeah.
important message for everyone who's listening, is that we could wait until we're all perfect at the
Yeah.
conversation and never have it, or we can just
I
step
think
into
that's what
it.
some people do, right?
Mhm.
I think some people are like, "Well, I suck at this. I don't know. I don't like to do things I suck at or I don't know about,
Yeah,
so I just won't do that."
yeah,
And I do know, having worked with people of color and folks who are read as white, are racialized as white, um, they may not ever have the conversation. And they
yeah,
might also be in communities where most of the people look like them and fit the dominant culture. Well, that's hard because then I don't have to have those conversations if I don't want to. And if I'm uncomfortable with it, I may not do that. And
right,
it is just as important to have um, these conversations in predominantly white spaces as it is in spaces of where people are mostly folks of color. So
absolutely.
I think Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, and having that kind of conversation is really important because it's a person who identifies as white talking about that experience. And, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, it is not to say that white people are bad. It is to say that this country is founded on inequity. And so you cannot fix what you do not name.
Yep.
Um,
And I think that's the big work in all of these systemic structures, moving from
yeah,
you're a bad white person to the systems that we operate were designed more for your success than someone who doesn't look like you. And so, how do we balance that out? What's the conversation that we need to be
yeah,
having? So,
I think so.
as we start to wind up, I'm just curious, what are two or three things that you think would be helpful for people to do, or for young people who are searching for their identity? What do you think would be helpful for them?
Yeah, for me, I'm glad you brought it back to this because I'm always gonna go back to the I. Know yourself first. So I think you hit on that, Bill, and it's so important. Like, know who you are first, and if you know that this is something that makes you uncomfortable and you're not well versed in it, start with you first. So that's the first thing, is start
Okay.
with you first. And that also includes self-care. So what do I do when I screw up? Because there is, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
Yep.
And if we offend somebody and we just run away from it, then we haven't made any forward momentum. So, what do I do? How do I feel when I make a mistake?
Okay.
What do I do for myself so that I can say I'm sorry without excusing, like, oh, I didn't mean that, right? It's like,
Right.
actually, what I said, I can see that it has upset you, and my job is always to make people feel better. What can I do for you now? So that starts with caring for yourself first.
Yep.
Like, you
Yep.
can't care for other people and be like, "Oh, how can I help you?" when you're like feeling dysregulated and upset and shame and guilt. Take care of yourself first so that you can get to a moment. So that's the first thing, is start with yourself.
Okay. So
And then
you're
for people who Yeah, and then for people who are working with little people and young people, answer the questions that are being asked. No more, no less. If a toddler is asking about skin tone, talk about skin tone. If an adolescent is talking about injustice, talk about injustice. So we give the child the answers that they are asking in the developmentally appropriate way. Because I've also seen adults talking to toddlers, and the glazed look
yeah.
where it's like, that's too much. They
All
want
right.
a 4 to 5 word answer. Give them the 4 to 5 word answer.
So the three things
So,
I heard you say are know yourself first, practice
mhm,
self care. So when you do make a mistake, just accept it, own it, apologize it, and move on. And then answer the asked question. If you're working with young people who ask you a question, don't embellish and
mhm.
elaborate, just answer the asked question. And
Yeah, and the best question is to ask them, why did you ask that?
yeah,
Like, if they, that's all. Sometimes they're asking because, oh, I just wanted to know the name of that color, or, oh,
yeah,
I'm wondering about injustice because I noticed a person who is living is an unhoused person, and I wonder about that.
yeah. Great. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. Let me see if I can say your name correctly. We've been chatting with Dr. Luz Casquejo-Johnston. Did I get
Very
it right?
close, Casquejo,
Casquejo.
like a Casquejo, like a Spanish name, last
Okay,
name.
great. So I'll keep practicing that. Names are important. So, how do people find you?
Mhm.
They have an interest in learning more about you or following up with some of the things that you offer.
Yeah, so I again work in the parenting space. I'm on Instagram, uh, Pop with Dr. Luz. And then online, I'm on my own website, drluz.live. So drluz.live. And that's where they can just get some information. They can um, join a newsletter that I'm starting. Um, but Instagram is where I do a lot of reels and talk directly to camera to parents to encourage them
Great.
while they're helping their children.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Luz, for engaging with me in this really fun conversation. And I think we may have more to talk about as we move forward. So you may hear another rendition of Dr. Luz and I having another conversation down the road. And so thank you so much for being our guest. And for those of you listening, you've been listening to the Origination Point podcast. My name is Bill De La Cruz, and I'm the host. And we're so happy that you have subscribed and that you're here listening. And we look forward to catching up with you on our next podcast. So take care and remember to keep growing.